All right, good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayyer. I am head of the Palestine Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, the Gaza ceasefire deal and the Trump administration, politics, prospects, and implications. After 15 horrific months of bombardment in the Gaza Strip, a ceasefire agreement was finally reached in the last days of the Biden administration with the involvement of officials from the incoming Trump administration as well. The deal, brokered by U.S., Qatari, and Egyptian mediators, will be implemented in phases, beginning with a temporary ceasefire and the exchange of some captive Israelis and Palestinians, and later proceed to talks regarding a broader end to the war. We've convened this panel of experts to discuss the recently announced ceasefire and hostage exchange agreement between Israel and Hamas, its prospects and challenges, the role of the United States and the Trump administration, and implications for Palestine, Israel, and for the region. Among the questions we hope to address: what factors prompted Hamas and Israel to agree at this time? What role did President-elect Trump play in pushing the deal forward? What does the ceasefire agreement entail, and how can we assess its prospects? What role will the Trump administration have to play in its implementation after the first phase? What will be the Trump administration's position towards Israel and Palestine in general? What are the implications of this ceasefire agreement for Gaza in particular and Palestinians more broadly? And what fallout might there be in Israeli politics and in the region at large? We're fortunate to have a wonderful group of experts to talk through these questions and more today. For today's conversation, we'll begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists, followed by questions, including Q&A with our audience. Please note that you do not need to wait until the Q&A portion to submit your questions for this morning's speakers. You can send your questions in at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. In the interest of time, now I want to move directly to briefly introducing our guests in the order that they will be presenting and then starting this discussion. Jihad Abu Salim is Executive Director of the Institute for Palestine Studies USA. Meirav Zonjain, Senior Analyst on Israel-Palestine at the International Crisis Group. Dalia Hatuka is independent journalist covering Palestinian and Israeli affairs. And Khalid El-Gindi is Middle East analyst and author and adjunct professor in Arab studies at Georgetown University. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being with us today. Jihad, will get started with you. If you could begin with your introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Youssef, and I'm grateful for the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. for the invitation, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to join you all today. Over the next 10 minutes, I will walk you through some anecdotes on the situation on the ground in Gaza, in addition to talking a little bit about the ceasefire agreement and what this tells us about the broader dynamics at play, whether in Palestine and beyond. To understand the current situation on the ground, it is essential to examine the type of war Israel has waged in Gaza. Beyond the constant shifting of Israel's military goals, whether claiming to dismantle this or that Hamas brigade or aiming to undermine Hamas and the other factions, it has become evident that over the past 16 months that Israel has systematically targeted the very foundations of Gaza's society and human existence in the Gaza Strip. Entire cities, neighborhoods, and communities, as well as educational, health, religious, and cultural institutions, have been relentlessly bombed and destroyed. The scale of the devastation in Gaza is staggering. Over 47,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, a number that continues to grow as rescue workers retrieve bodies from the rubble. Thousands remain missing, buried under the debris, or scattered, or their remains are scattered in different parts of the Gaza Strip. Since the ceasefire began, dozens of bodies have been recovered from destroyed homes. A study published in The Lancet estimates the death toll during the first 9 months of the war is approximately 40% higher than the figures reported by the Palestinian Health Ministry. This is because the Palestinian Health Ministry only documents the deaths of the bodies it receives. Thousands remain, as I mentioned, buried under the rubble or missing. Over 111,000 people have been injured, with the World Health Organization reporting that nearly 23,000 of them have sustained life-altering injuries requiring rehabilitation. Severe limb injuries are among the most prevalent, leaving Gaza home to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. The displacement is staggering. 1.9 million Palestinians, that's 90% of Gaza's population, remain displaced. The destruction includes over 136,000 structures and 245,000 housing units that have been damaged or destroyed. More than 92% of primary roads, 84% of health facilities, and 70% of water and sanitation infrastructure have been obliterated. Every day, 60,000 cubic meters of untreated raw sewage, equivalent to 24 Olympic-sized swimming pools, flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Additionally, 320 miles, that's 510 kilometers, of Gaza's electrical grid has been destroyed. That's equivalent to the distance of a round trip between New York City and Washington, D.C. This glimpse of the destruction highlights the catastrophic scale of Israel's campaign, which has aimed to render Gaza uninhabitable. However, this has occurred within the context of contradictory, incoherent, and ultimately unachievable military and political objectives by Israel. Israel has simultaneously pursued a counterinsurgency strategy seeking to delegitimize and undermine Gaza's armed factions while inflicting collective punishment, death, and destruction on Gaza's population. Yet, Israel's indiscriminate brutality, displacing Palestinians, killing civilians, and destroying entire communities has spared no one. From the general's plan to settlers-led initiatives calling for ethnic cleansing and the resettlement of Gaza, there has been one constant over the past 16 months. Israel has lacked a clearly defined political vision for Gaza. Its military campaign has failed to achieve any tangible political gains, and the disconnect between the political and military leadership in Israel has been starkly visible. 15 months later, Hamas remains present in Gaza, along with other factions. Despite the devastating loss of life and destruction, Gaza's civilian, law enforcement, and civil society capacities, or what is left of them, have re-emerged to varying degrees, assuming roles in managing life and restoring order. This reality underscores a critical point I made on November 6, 2023, just 1 month into Israel's assault on Gaza. Israel will not achieve a military victory in Gaza. A political solution remains the only viable path forward. While Israel has demonstrated its ability to inflict devastating harm on Palestinians and on the people of Lebanon, brute force alone is insufficient to address the broader political realities. One of the key lessons from the past 16 months is that diplomacy and political engagement, not coercion or the imposition of one-sided biased agendas, are essential for resolving crises. In the case of Palestine and Israel, a just and sustainable resolution can only emerge through genuine political engagement and recognition that and a recognition of Palestinian lives, rights, and dignity. Just very quickly on the ceasefire deal. The ceasefire agreement itself is structured into 3 phases. We're currently in the first phase. and it involves an immediate halt to hostilities and the exchange of 33 Israeli hostages for a number of Palestinian prisoners, including women, children, and elderly, and the introduction of much-needed humanitarian aid, around 600 trucks a day carrying food, medicine, and fuel. The second phase, which hopefully we will be able to pass into, we expect more hostage and prisoner exchanges alongside a partial withdrawal of Israeli forces from key areas in Gaza. And finally, the third phase would envision a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, the reopening of border crossings, and the start of large-scale reconstruction efforts to rebuild Gaza's shattered infrastructure. The success of this ceasefire agreement will depend on its implementation by all parties, the adherence of all sides, and the ability of the mediators, especially the United States, to ensure the continuation of the implementation of the agreement's phases. Why did the ceasefire agreement happen now? In order to answer that, we need to consider the motivations of all the parties involved. For Hamas, of course, the deal was about more than just securing an end to the 15-month-long constant bombardment of Gaza and the killing of Palestinians there. For the Palestinian people in general, and for Palestinians in Gaza, the end of the 15-month-long bombardment of the Gaza Strip sends an important message that Palestinians will continue to exist as an important player and an important force and an important factor in the past, in the present, and in the future of the region. For Israel, and I think my colleagues here will talk about this, Netanyahu faced growing pressures, both domestically and internationally, to agree to this deal. Ultimately, the cost of continuing the war, politically, economically, and in terms of public opinion, became unsustainable. And of course, the most important factor had to do with the United States' role. While the Biden administration, working alongside Qatar and Egypt, worked for months on brokering this deal, President-elect Trump pushed for a quick resolution before his inauguration. Now, for Palestinians in Gaza, the most important question remains if the pressures that led to the realization of this deal prior to President Trump's inauguration would continue, allowing for the second and third phases to be implemented. Ultimately, the success of this agreement will depend on whether both sides adhere to the terms. On the Palestinian side, of course, there is an absolute commitment to the continuation of the deal, especially in light of the harm that has been inflicted of Palestinians and the consequences of the past 15 months. And of course, this is something that the international community must remain engaged on. It's not enough to broker a deal. There must be sustained oversight and support to ensure the deal's implementation by the mediators and other forces within the international community, ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, the facilitation of reconstruction efforts, and ensure that the US remains engaged in a meaningful way. And finally, Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians everywhere hope that the end of this 15-month-long genocide would present an opportunity to recognize that the systematic denial of Palestinian political and human rights is something that needs to be addressed. And a ceasefire in Gaza is just the beginning, especially also as we witness further escalation in the West Bank as Israel launched a new operation in Jenin, one that many anticipate to expand and engulf other parts of the West Bank. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jihad. We'll turn now to Meirav. Meirav?
Thanks, Yusuf. It's good to be here with all of you. So, I mean, as Jihad outlined, what's kind of astounding from the Israeli perspective is that after so many months of throwing so much military force, Israel has the strongest military in the Middle East. It did not hold back for the most part. Biden didn't hold Israel back. The destruction really speaks for itself. And still, there's no strategic change as far as Israel is concerned. If Israel defined its operations in Gaza over the last decade as mowing the grass, what we see now is mowing the grass on a much more devastating and unconscionable level. But it's not more than that. And I think Israelis see that. The military also has been very critical of the way in which Netanyahu and his government have led this war. And I think that there's questions about, if before this war, Netanyahu's policy, as Israelis understand it, was to keep Hamas in power in Gaza in order to avoid engagement in any kind of political process towards a Palestinian state, towards any kind of resolution. I'm not necessarily convinced that his policy has changed. Maybe he still wants Hamas in power in Gaza. There's no way to prove that, but and it's certainly very hard to dismantle and destroy Hamas in the way that Israel has defined its war objective. But that's something that I think we need to take into account after all this time. And I think it is kind of consensus. I've heard Israeli military former officials talk about it, other people and commentators, that Israel lost the war right now in Gaza. It might have won the war against the axis of resistance, or it might have dealt a very serious blow to Iran and its proxies. Hezbollah, obviously, it changed the dynamic there. It also didn't have the same objectives in Lebanon. But I think a lot of people in Israel understand that the military force has its limits. It also has its costs. And as Jihad kind of alluded to, there's been a very big tension between the military and the political echelon in Israel. The military got behind a ceasefire in Gaza in May, when supposedly the Israeli cabinet, not supposedly, it did authorize the outline that Biden then presented. And in some ways, Biden tried to get Netanyahu to do what Trump actually got Netanyahu to do, by kind of forcing him to accept that outline. And so in addition to Israelis, I think, seeing that nothing has been achieved strategically, they also understand that this could have been achieved months and months and months ago. And people whose families who had hostages who were killed, they understand that they were killed because Netanyahu did not go for this deal. So there is, in terms of, the mood in Israel, there is consensus that this hostage deal should happen. There's been polls for months now that show a majority were willing to end the war in order to get the hostages. At the same time, Israelis have expected Hamas to be removed from power. And I think many of them still expect that to happen, and they don't understand what's going to happen now. So, in some ways, the far right in Israel, which is promising to resume the war, and Netanyahu might, make the appearance like he has to go with them. There's one side of it. The other side is the Israelis who wanted the hostage deal, but also want answers about what the day after is going to look like, what security is going to look like on the border with Gaza. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. And the ceasefire, while, it was so necessary, and for people on the ground, I think it's hard to convey outside what a relief it is to have a ceasefire. It, of course, has tons of holes. And the kind of, it seems like Trump clinched the deal. It seems pretty clear. Now, Netanyahu's heard Trump talking since he was elected. Netanyahu clearly prepared for the fact that he might have to go for this deal. I don't think Netanyahu wanted to go for the deal now. I think Trump, forced his hand for various of his own interests and reasons. But Netanyahu also has prepared himself for this day. And so, I'm still on the fence about how much the kind of, how much it's been orchestrated to make it seem like the far right, push Netanyahu and he had no choice. Netanyahu is a very, very resilient politician. And I think he is also preparing for the fact that he might be on borrowed time at this point, that an election is on the horizon for him, that his coalition could collapse. Even before the ceasefire, his coalition was on edge because of budgetary issues, because of the conscription into the army of ultra-Orthodox Jews. So there's other issues that he's been challenged with. And so he might have already taken the consideration, the calculation that eventually the war is going to have to end, and eventually I might have to deal with a new election. And so he wants to do it from a place of being on a good note with Trump. And I think he and Trump both have an eye towards the Saudi normalization deal. So I think that's a big part of what we're seeing here. And so that's kind of, I think the state of play. I guess I'll just add that, while I think many of us are very skeptical that the ceasefire will hold, and there's many, many holes in it and reasons why it could fall apart, and while Netanyahu's political survival might lean on whether or not it holds or not, I think it will be a lot harder than we realize for Israel to go back and resume the war in Gaza the way that Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and other far-right ministers would like. One of the reasons Israel opposed the ability of residents in Gaza to move back up north into the northern part of Gaza was not a security issue. It was because they know that the minute so many people come back, it'll be harder to go back in, even just for logistical reasons, if not for ethical reasons. So, I do have somewhat, I'm somewhat hopeful and optimistic that the dynamic also in Israel of seeing hostages released, seeing that negotiations and diplomacy are the only way to free hostages and to even think about some kind of day after for everybody is through a deal, through negotiations, and the fact that the political capital of the Qatari government and the new incoming Trump administration are on this because they want it off the table and they want to do other things with their time. Not because I think they care too much about the lives of the people here, but that to me could be reason to think that there could be more to this, and that also Netanyahu, as a resilient politician, will find a way to get through his political survival, even with this deal going through. And I just want to note that if there were elections called, it would take about 3 months. But as we've seen in many, many election cycles, Netanyahu's polling was very bad in the beginning of the war. Now it's bounced back a little. His Likud party is still the majority party, but he probably would not be able to form a coalition. The thing is that nobody else would either. So we could be in a cycle where Netanyahu remains caretaker prime minister through election cycles where no coalition is built. And so he stays in power de facto anyway. So he also might be taking that into account. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Meirav. We know, of course, while there has been a ceasefire agreement reached in Gaza, there is escalating violence against Palestinians now, in particular in the West Bank, settler violence reaching new levels, Israeli military operations expanding in the West Bank as well. I want to turn to Dalia now to give us the perspective about what is happening on the ground in the West Bank.
Thanks, Yusuf. So I'll just begin by just talking a little bit about what's been going on the ground. From yesterday, the Israeli military has been conducting, as you mentioned, a large-scale raid on particularly the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. They've killed at least 10 Palestinians. They've injured more than 35 to 50. The operation, which is interestingly enough, has been dubbed Iron Wall by the Israeli forces, is undoubtedly aimed at escalating violence across the West Bank. not only to appease, the right-wing formations that are threatening to dismantle Netanyahu's coalition, namely Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but also because to appease, the settlers themselves. And it's also over, it's somewhat a diversion following the resignation of Israeli military commanders over their failures on October 7th. So now what we're seeing in Jenin is a large-scale invasion. There's a heavy military presence entering the camp. There's also the use of Apache gunships. There has been shooting of live fire at residents. But the thing is that the escalations by Israel have increased since the announcement of the ceasefire. We've seen something that we see almost on a daily basis: Israeli settlers under the protection of the state carrying out violent attacks across the West Bank, setting fire to homes, vehicles, properties, injuring people, even nurseries, and it's part and parcel of an ever-escalating routine of violence, ultimately intended to drive Palestinian residents out of their communities. The thing is also the situation on the ground was tense even before the ceasefire in Gaza took effect. So in the first 2 weeks or 13 days of 2025, at least 9 Palestinians were killed, including 4 children. And this doesn't even take into account what happened in Jenin today. The settler attacks, for example, the UN has been looking at those, and the ones that have been causing casualties, they involve like the use of flammable liquids, Molotov cocktails. There's been a huge surge in access restrictions and attacks by Israeli settlers, even in Area B of the West Bank, which is supposed to be under the Palestinian Authority's administrative rule and the security control of the Israelis. But ultimately, the Israelis are in control of everything in those areas. But since the ceasefire was signed, there's been a surge in, as I mentioned, Israeli settler attacks. But also, I've noticed, I was just in the West Bank 2 days ago, and the Israeli military has been closing off the West Bank. They've been sealing off villages and cities, cutting them off from one another. Right now, you can't get into or out of Bethlehem, Hebron, and other places. Settlers have killed a Palestinian child in Sebastia near Nablus. They've been carrying out what's known as price tag attacks, which is in apparent retribution for the Israeli army's failure in Gaza. We've been seeing all these new metal gates being erected by the army to stop Palestinian movement. Even Jericho, a lifeline for people trying to get to Jordan and from Jordan to elsewhere, has been sealed off, or people are being made to wait for hours at a single checkpoint. But I think it's also important to mention that even before the ceasefire, the Palestinian Authority has also been aiding and abetting the Israeli occupation, for the lack of a better phrase. They launched one of the largest operations since their own creation back in the day in Jenin refugee camp on the 5th of December. They besieged the camp, sending thousands of families out of the camp, like to be displaced to Jenin city and the surrounding villages. The people who remained are struggling to meet basic needs. There are shortages of food, water, and electricity. The 4 UNRWA schools over there have been closed, which have affected at least 1,500 students. there is widespread damage that I can only describe as being akin to the damage that was made years ago during the Second Intifada. The damage has happened to homes, water networks, electricity. Honestly, it's a devastated area. The infrastructure, the roads, there's hardly anything there. But 2 days after the ceasefire started, the PA forces left the area only for the camp to be bombarded by Israeli forces. And so, you know, not a single shot was taken by the Palestinian Authority, except towards fellow Palestinians. And right now we're looking at this, you know, Operation Iron Wall, which Israeli media is saying that the first phase of which is supposed to last at least 6 weeks. That's, I think, a low estimate. But you know, this work in together between the Palestinian Authority and Israel is not lost on Palestinians, because again, it's a reinforcement of the view that the PA is another arm or an extension of the occupation. And what they did in Jenin camp reinforced people's belief that the PA is working together with Israel to ensure that any kind of resistance is stifled. To go back to the issue of the ceasefire in Gaza, even as Palestinians in the West Bank are celebrating the ceasefire and the release of the 90 women and children from Israeli prisons, I mean, people can't help but feel that there's something terrible coming their way. The first thing that happened shortly after the 90 were released was that Israeli forces, which is something that they always do, they detained 60 others from the West Bank town of Azun. And again, Palestinian fears are being reinforced by the rise in settler attacks, the choking effect of the closures and the checkpoints. It also coincides with the inauguration of Donald Trump as US president. And, you know, everybody's seen what his last administration did, how it showed immense pro-Israeli bias. And he's already, even before he took office, he was being hailed by settlers as someone who will make 2025 the year that he green lights the formal annexation of the West Bank. Finally, I'll just say that the Palestinian Authority has not really been talking much about the ceasefire agreement. There hasn't been any you know, formal celebrations, so to speak. They haven't called for public celebrations, as they often do with similar occasions that involve Fatah. If anything, the PA went into Jenin with the hope that it can show the Israeli authorities that it can handle governing the Gaza Strip once, you know, the war ends there. And the PA basically doesn't even see the fact that Netanyahu has repeatedly said that he wouldn't allow the PA to administer the Gaza Strip once the war ends, even when the US and much of the international community back its return. And right now what we're seeing is that there's a lot of talk about who's going to be in charge. It seems the Egyptians and others want the PA with the aid of an international force to take over at the border, but obviously I don't see Netanyahu doing that. Maybe Mayrav can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, but that's it from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dalia. Before we turn it over to Khaled, just a reminder for our audience tuning in, you can submit your questions for the panelists through the Zoom Q&A feature or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org, and we'll get to questions after this. But first, Khaled, The mic is yours.
Thanks, and it's hard to follow such great analysis by my fellow panelists, but yeah, I'll focus a little bit on the Trump role in particular, both in the ceasefire and in going forward. I think in terms of clinching a ceasefire, it's very hard to ignore, as we already heard, the Trump factor. Trump made it clear to everyone that he wanted this war to end, that there needed to be a ceasefire in place by the time he came to office on January 20th. And that's what happened. And I think as far as Trump was concerned, that was probably more about the headline of the ceasefire than it was about the details, or, he's not really a details guy. But it was important for him to have that headline in sort of buttressing his credentials as the peacemaker. That's been a major theme of his throughout his campaign, but also since being elected, that he's the guy who can bring peace, that can end wars, and so forth. So it was really important, and it was also clear that from Israeli officials, that pressure from Trump did make a difference to Netanyahu, as we heard from Meirav and others. Netanyahu was not keen to sign on a deal and dragged his feet for as long as he possibly could under Biden, and decided that he could no longer do that. And so he ended up doing, Trump was able to do the one thing that Biden was not, which is to change Netanyahu's calculations through some form of pressure. I think implementation of the ceasefire, which now Trump inherits in its entirety, is going to be a major challenge. The Israeli leadership has made no secret. Their spokespeople regularly highlight the point that this is a temporary ceasefire, and that they insist that they will continue to, they will try to finish the job of destroying Hamas, which I think, as we already heard, is not an achievable goal, but was something that allowed Netanyahu to perpetuate the war more or less indefinitely. So I think it's clear that Netanyahu needs this war in some fashion in order for him to remain in power. And I'm fairly confident that he will test Trump's limits to see what he can get away with as much as he can. The question will be, and so it would not surprise me at all if the very precarious arrangements that exist even in this phase one, if there was some delay in the release of any of the Israeli captives, or some other pretext that would allow Netanyahu to return to full-scale war, maybe not on the same level, but in some capacity. The question remains, though, how would Trump respond to either Israeli violations or a full resumption of the war? The fact is, rhetorically at least, that Trump administration officials, even before they came to office, were pretty clear that they support the goal of total destruction of Hamas, at least publicly. Privately, we don't know to what extent they actually believe that is achievable, but it's not something that we could ignore. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of variables that make the situation hard to predict. The first and foremost is Donald Trump is highly unpredictable. That's part of his persona. That is who he is, and that's, I think, Trump's unpredictability is what made Netanyahu maybe think twice about whether to sign on to the ceasefire deal or not. That said, I do think he will try to test Trump's limits. The other thing we know about Donald Trump is that he is highly transactional. And so it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where Trump might end up giving Netanyahu something in the West Bank in return, say, for example, to adhering to or not resuming the war in Gaza. That is not an inconceivable scenario given the many proponents of the greater Israel that exist in the administration. And I think if there is any ideological coherence, and I don't think there's a lot, but to the extent that there is within the Trump administration, it is on this question, whether it's Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, or Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador, or the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. All of them are greater Israelists and who have a great deal of public contempt for Palestinians. And so that is, I think, a very conceivable scenario. But I think another variable that will matter to Donald Trump is the region. If there's pushback, particularly from the Saudis, it's no secret that Donald Trump would like to build on his successes of the Abraham Accords from his first term. Joe Biden tried but failed in large part because of his unconditional support for Israel. But Donald Trump, I think, is almost certainly going to pick up that thread again and try to bring that home. Again, I think he's positioned himself as someone who's a peacemaker. He wants to have that Nobel Prize. And so the Saudi factor will act as a constraint on and a motivation of sorts for Trump if he wants to bring them into a normalization deal with Israel. That will require major concessions on the Palestinian front, things that ultimately Netanyahu may not be willing to do, and probably if I were betting, I would say he wouldn't be able to do, but that will be a motivation for Donald Trump going forward. Lastly, I'll say there is, as I said, there's not a lot of ideological coherence within the Trump administration, despite the existence of this very solidly pro-greater Israel and anti-Palestinian trend. There is actually some tension in the Trump camp and in the Republican Party more generally, between the pro-Israel, between the pro-greater Israel folks and the America First ethos of the MAGA movement. We see some of that in the Tucker Carlson rhetoric, people who are close to Donald Trump, because of that tension where, Israel is seen as a country that could drag the United States into these wars that he has committed the U.S. would not get involved in. And so there is this kind of budding, I wouldn't call it anti-Israel, but certainly a trend within conservative and MAGA circles that is highly critical of Israel and the role that it plays as far as international and especially military interventions. And so it's a mixed picture overall, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for that, Khalid. I want to just return to Jihad with a couple of questions, and I have a few questions for each of you regarding your remarks, and we'll open it up for audience Q&A. Jihad, a couple of questions for you. What indications do we have about how Hamas may approach the negotiations and or its relationship with the United States any differently now that there is a new administration, a Trump administration? And secondly, what are the sticking points in the second and third phase of this agreement, and what, from the Palestinian perspective, do you see as red lines?
Thank you, Yusuf, for these questions. Yesterday, Musa Abu Marzouk, who's a member of Hamas's political bureau, expressed readiness on the part of Hamas to engage with the United States. What this engagement looks like, it's not clear to me. But I think Hamas and other political forces in Palestine realize that while the ceasefire agreement is loaded with many sticking points and gaps, and while there are many fears that it might collapse, they also recognize that there might be many openings with this new administration, and especially also with the changes that have been taking place in the region, that might, as I mentioned, create openings for a new era of political engagement on Palestine and with Palestinians. Now, of course, there are many obstacles that would prevent that from happening. The Palestinian body politic is and has been and continues to be fragmented. And this is mostly due to the international community's refusal and rejection for any kind of arrangement within the Palestinian political context that would allow for Palestinian unity, and therefore would allow Palestinians to engage politically with a unified body politic. And I think, again, as Khalid said and others, I think the region is an important factor in all of this. If there is a push on the part of regional players, mainly Saudi Arabia, and of course we've seen the role that Egypt and Qatar played in making this deal, or at least the first phase of this deal, happen. I think if there is a push on the part of the region towards stability, towards calm, towards reconstruction, whether for transactional factors that relate to the Trump administration, or just because these different players need to ensure their narrow interests, I think it will depend on what these regional forces will end up pushing for and how they manage their relationship with the new US administration. Without Palestinian unity, without ending Palestinian political fragmentation, I think engaging beyond reaching an arrangement like the ceasefire in Gaza will not be possible. So I think there is this important step that needs to happen, but it cannot happen if it's still going to be sanctioned by the international community. I think the region, I don't think a country like Egypt would have put the immense effort that it dedicated over the past 15 months to push for and broker this ceasefire deal if it was convinced that Hamas will go away. I think Egypt understands that Hamas is there to stay in Gaza, and therefore it helped broker this deal, and created the diplomatic and political context for this, that allowed this deal to happen, because Egypt understands that its national security and stability are tied to ending this war in Gaza and pushing for diplomatic engagement when it comes to Palestine and Israel. So I hope this answers your first question. Now, with regards to the sticking points, I think for Palestinians in Gaza, restoring the contiguity of the Gaza Strip, something that would require full Israeli withdrawal from the so-called Netzarim corridor and from the Salah ad-Din or the Philadelphia corridor in the south. I think these are things that matter to Palestinians. Ensuring the return of displaced people to the area north of Wadi Gaza or the Gaza Valley, or what we have been calling Northern Gaza throughout this war. This is the area that includes Gaza City and the northern governorate, which includes the cities of Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and Jabalia. There is like nearly 700 to 1 million people who have been displaced south of Wadi Gaza, who are awaiting their return. It is anticipated that that Israel would start allowing people to return to the north following the second hostage exchange, which is scheduled to take place on Saturday, I believe. We don't know what this would look like. We don't know. There's all this talk about security contractors coming to the Netzarim corridor and creating some sort of a screening process. The logistics of that are not clear, but what matters is the principle. I mean, the Gaza Strip, right until the beginning of this war, was the largest contiguous part of historic Palestine in terms of its geographic area, even though the Gaza Strip constitutes what amounts to 1% of the total area of the territory between the river and the sea. So full Israeli withdrawal, and of course the beginning of the reconstruction process and the rebuilding of the infrastructure and allowing more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. And when I talk about reconstruction, I'm not just talking about rebuilding residential units. I'm talking about rebuilding hospitals, rebuilding schools, rebuilding the essential infrastructure for resuming life as Palestinians once knew it before the war. And of course, the Palestinians even still struggled before the war. But of course, this is something that, so if there will be any kind of delay or any issues that might emerge with regards to any of these points, I think that might derail the implementation of the deal and create the possibility for its collapse.
Thanks for that, Jihad. I have a question for you, and you got to this a little bit in your introductory remarks. Recently, we learned that more Israeli military leaders announced their resignations, taking responsibility for the failures of October 7th. The political leadership, of course, has not done this. Will this happen? And how might the implementation of the deal impact the likelihood of such an outcome?
I don't see that happening. I don't see Netanyahu resigning. I don't see any of the ministers who are in government resigning. They also are resisting a commission of inquiry, an independent state commission of inquiry into the failures of October 7th. This is a coalition that wants to survive. The threat by Smotrich also to leave is not necessarily that believable because of how badly his party is polling and how much he's been able to do in the West Bank since he came into this position. So, I don't see them letting go of power. I think we all understand that we're in this mess because Netanyahu wants to stay in power. So, I don't see that happening. And it's an interesting question because in Israel, nobody even asked that. I mean, it's obvious to everyone that Netanyahu should quit. And even amongst Likud voters, I think around half of them have polled saying he should leave politics, whether now or after the war is over. So there's a consensus, but nobody expects that to happen. So in short, no, I don't expect that to happen.
Thanks, Meirav. Dalia, the past 15 months have been an extremely dark chapter in Palestinian history, perhaps among the darkest and most dramatic, and yet the Palestinian Authority has been almost non-existent in it all. What do you think the implications of this will be for how the public perceives the Palestinian Authority, and how do you understand the way the Palestinian Authority even sees its own role at this stage?
Well, There's a saying in Arabic that we use in I won't say it in Arabic, but essentially what the PA is doing is playing dead, basically. And if it's not playing dead in the situation, I mean, which it has been all throughout, it's just been going after these small, resistance groups inside Jenin camp, and ultimately, they're hurting either some of the members of these groups, or they're, killing bystanders, and in one case, there was a female journalist that they killed as well, the PA security forces. But honestly, it's quite embarrassing to see how quiet, or how perhaps delusional the Palestinian Authority has been all throughout this time. You see these statements that have come out from the Palestinian Authority presidency. For example, the day after they left Jenin, when the Israelis started going back into the camp and they started killing people, and you see the statement from the PA being like, "Oh, we condemn what the Israelis are doing there," as if as if Palestinians are naive and have not been able to see the kind of cooperation that's been going on between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before, perhaps 1,000 times, but Mahmoud Abbas views security coordination between the PA and Israel as sacred, and he's used that word before, which is very interesting, and it ultimately sheds light on the way he perceives his own role as president of the Palestinian Authority. So the fact that the PA, not only it started this crackdown on the coalition of armed groups, the Jenin brigades and what have you, they have also denied responsibility for killing some of the people in Jenin camp. They've blamed outlaws, whoever these are. But also the PA went after Al Jazeera, for example. I mean, Al Jazeera is believed to be the most popular media network in the West Bank. Now, if you look for Al Jazeera on satellite TVs, you won't be able to find it. You need a VPN to access it online. And they closed Al Jazeera's office as well. And of course, they blamed it on outside forces. Namely, I mean, they didn't say Iran, but that's what they're talking about. And funnily enough, it's exactly right out of like the the textbook of authoritarians like Sisi and others, who always justify these policies and these crackdowns on outside forces that are stirring strife in the country. But finally, what I'll say is that, people are seeing that what the PA is doing is part of a broader attempt to silence criticism of not only its security operations in the Jenin refugee camp, but in general. Because, I mean, as you may recall, the PA was responsible for the killing of one of the critics and activists, Nizar Banat, who died in custody in 2021. And the PA has, I mean, almost 4 years on, has failed to adequately investigate his death. I think that honestly, the PA is in a very difficult situation, especially now with Trump coming in, and they're from the statements that I've been seeing, Mahmoud Abbas has been trying to curry favor and to say that he's willing to do this and that, but ultimately it doesn't matter because his role is very insignificant, and it's really laughable almost if it wasn't, such a drastic, awful situation that you see foreign dignitaries and policymakers and whatnot going and meeting with Mahmoud Abbas as if he has any say in what goes on in Gaza. So it's interesting that, again, the modus operandi of the Europeans and the Americans is to shore up support for Abbas, but honestly, there is no support to be made for him among Palestinians, neither in the West Bank. I mean, the West Bank more so because of Fatah's presence, but definitely not in Gaza either. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. Khalid, for you, can you talk about the role of U.S. bilateral relationships with other actors in the region and how important these might be in shaping Trump's handling of Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this a little bit in previously, but I think this is probably the only real motivation that the Trump administration would have in addressing any Palestinian concerns at all. I'm not remotely optimistic about what Trump has to offer Palestinians. I think he offers at least the same level of unconditional support that we saw under Biden, and quite probably more. But if there is a constraint on that impulse to basically just defer to Israel on everything, it will come from the rest of the region. Obviously, Egypt is going to be a major player in terms of the future of Gaza. And as we know, Trump is quite fond of the Sisi regime. And so he will want to hear what they have to say about how to shape the future in Gaza. And it won't always align with the preferences of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he will also be listening to the Saudis in particular and other Gulf states about a way forward. Certainly in terms of reconstruction and any sort of stabilization in Gaza, they will absolutely need the resources of Arab Gulf states. And we know that the Emiratis want to play a major role in shaping Gaza's future, and that role or that vision for Gaza is, let's say, more aligned with the Israeli vision than it is with, say, the Egyptian vision. And so there is going to be, a question of how Trump administration people are going to balance these competing interests. The Emiratis are important actors, the Saudis are important actors, and so are the Egyptians. So there really is, I think, to the extent that the Arab states could get on the same page with one another, if not with whatever remains of the Palestinian leadership, I think that will be crucial. But certainly, I think the Saudis will play a key role, if only for the fact that Trump desperately wants to rekindle, to pursue an Abraham Accords 2.0, and there will be a cost there, and the cost will be something like Palestinian statehood, probably in ways that Netanyahu can't accept. But it will be, I think, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. One other point I just wanted to make that I didn't make in the first time around is with regard to how Trump might approach this issue in general. President Biden laid out, I wouldn't call them red lines, but were, let's say, parameters for a post-war Gaza. And Those were things like no permanent reoccupation of Gaza, no displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, no reduction in Gaza's territory, and so forth. And of course, Israel has rejected pretty much all of those, whether in word or in deed. But Trump, at least as of this very early stage, has not repudiated those. It'll be very interesting to see what, if any, of those, since he is picking apart the Biden policy bit by bit, he hasn't repudiated that yet. Perhaps it's just not important enough to him to do that, or perhaps it's just understood that they don't apply. But that's something that I'm going to be looking at in the future, and something that certainly Arab states could weigh in on, because those are things that would also align with their interests.
Thank you, Khaled. I want to turn now to questions from our audience. There are a number of them. Let's start with this one regarding UNRWA. Perhaps we can direct this to both Jihad and Dalia. What do you see happening to Palestinians if Israel forces out UNRWA, as early as next week? Of course, there's been legislation in the Israeli Knesset that calls for that. What agencies can take over the role that UNRWA has had, if any? UNRWA employs many thousands of Palestinians. What is the potential fallout from this, either in Gaza or in the West Bank? Maybe, Jihad, we start with you, and then we'll turn to Dalia.
It's really difficult, if not impossible, for other organizations to replace UNRWA at the current moment, especially in Gaza, and especially in light of the scale of destruction, displacement, and devastation that I have described in my remarks. So this will create this will make a difficult situation even way worse. And of course, we will continue dealing with this dynamic that keeps emerging and re-emerging. Israel creates disasters, creates catastrophes, and then leaves it to the region, to Palestinians, to the international community to do the damage, to do damage control, and to try to figure out how to deal with the impacts of Israel's policies and the measures it takes. Considering that, these are sometimes the policies and measures that Israel does, they happen as part of the narrow political battles inside the Israeli political space, politicians like Netanyahu trying to show victories here or there, or to satisfy this or that right-wing cabinet member, and so on. So I think, there isn't an operation right now that can replace UNRWA in terms of its ability to meet the needs of millions of Palestinians, refugees in the West Bank and in Gaza, as I mentioned, in the Gaza Strip, especially in light of the destruction and devastation and the immense needs of the local communities in Gaza. So I think this would have a devastating impact on Palestinians. I'll let Dalia also build on this if she's interested.
Just to kind of reiterate what Jihad was saying, forcing out UNRWA would not just be a logistical and humanitarian disaster, but obviously it would be a political one as well, because essentially it would be stripping refugees of a key institutional advocate. It would also signal an attempt to erase their political status as refugees, which has been central to the Palestinian struggle, obviously, for justice and self-determination. The long-term impact also would probably exacerbate the cycle of displacement, poverty, and also resistance, because people aren't going to sit there and just take it, lying down, so to speak. The implications, I would just go through them. Obviously, there's the humanitarian crisis in Gaza alone, where over 70% of the population are registered refugees. The loss of these services would exacerbate an already dire humanitarian situation. We've got poverty, malnutrition, the health crises. The employment collapse. I mean, UNRWA is one of the largest employers of Palestinians. There's nearly, I believe, 30,000 staff, most of them Palestinian refugees. The political fallout, the move could escalate tensions, because the issue would be seen as an attack on refugees' rights and further erosion of their political status. And refugees themselves, they see UNRWA as a custodian of their internationally recognized right to return under UN Resolution 194. So it's possible that its removal could provoke, more protests or unrest. And finally, without UNRWA, there would be a vacuum in essential services. I don't think local authorities or NGOs are equipped to scale up operations to replace what UNRWA delivers. Yes, there's the UNHCR, the World Food Program, and UNICEF, but each of these has a mandate or an expertise, and they lack something that UNRWA can provide altogether. So, for example, WFP, it could potentially scale up food assistance, but it can't provide education, health, social services, all of which UNRWA has been offering. And finally, I mean, we could see maybe some wealthy Gulf countries or private donors fund temporary solutions, but the political will and the sustainability of such funding are uncertain.
Thank you, Dalia. Mayor, I have a question for you from the audience. Even if many Israelis realize now that Hamas has not been destroyed and that a military solution is beyond Israeli capacity, how has the support for a political solution, they note here the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, how has support for that evolved among the Israeli public at all since October 7th?
It's a good question. Israelis are, largely a body politic that is very right-wing. The notion of Palestinian statehood is not something that's discussed. The political echelon openly rejects it and works very hard and says that it's working very hard to never allow it to happen. And then those who are, the two-state solution isn't something that's talked about in Israel. The parties that are considered center-left, the opposition, they don't talk about a two-state solution. I think at best they talk about separation from the Palestinians. So it's not even in the discourse anymore. So there isn't, and I don't think Israelis, even after October 7th, even after they realize that they're not able to pretend like Palestinians don't exist, and even after trying to literally, reduce the Palestinian population, they're still not in a place that they're able to talk about a political resolution. It's just not there. Now, that being said, I will say that I think that the trauma and the shift and dynamics of October 7th, the amount of people who have lost faith in the government, in Israeli institutions, the kind of breakdown of the concept that you could just continue to be an occupying power forever and never do anything about it, that is changing. And the political patterns and behavior of people who have been displaced in the north and in the south of Israel, people who have supported Netanyahu. I mean, one of the most famous or the famous mother of a hostage held in Gaza, Einav Tsangauker, she's like a hardcore Likudnik from a low socioeconomic level in Israel. And what she's been saying recently, other than being like on the forefront of blaming Netanyahu for not bringing back her son, she's been talking about recently how because of this war, she has left the cult of the Netanyahu right. Like she now sees the light and understands why they were not serving her interests. So I think those changes are occurring in Israeli society, but it will take a long time for them to take hold, and we'll have to see how different political parties arise. But the fact remains in Israel today that no political party talks about a political solution or about Palestinian statehood as an interest of Israel as well. That's just not something that is talked about.
Thank you, Meirav. Khaled, the other day we heard now President Trump being asked about the normalization agreement, the potential normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, asked if he would, increase pressure to sort of make that happen. And he said, I don't need to press them. It's almost ready to go. It can happen soon. I'm paraphrasing, but somewhere along those lines. How do you see that playing out in the weeks and months to come?
Yeah, I'll tackle that in a moment. Can I just address the UNRWA issue as well, just to add to the points that were already made? So one of the ironies here is that UNRWA, if you eliminate UNRWA as a service provider, that only makes Palestinians more reliant on Hamas to provide those services, right? That's one of the many contradictions in this policy that Netanyahu is pursuing, this very zero-sum policy. So there really isn't an alternative. The only three actors who could play any role in service providing in Gaza would be Hamas as a government, UNRWA, and the Palestinian Authority. And the Israeli government has ruled out all three of them. And that's not for practical reasons. That is itself a reflection, that kind of zero-sum absolutism that is just unworkable, really underscores the extremism of this Israeli government. I mean, you eliminate options and all of their alternatives, and so it's just not workable, and ultimately backfires because it reinforces the hand of precisely the group that they don't want most, which is Hamas. On the question of Saudi Israel normalization, I don't think it's a done deal. I think the signals that the Saudis have given the past several months have made it clear that the price, whatever they might have accepted before October 7th, as far as concessions on the Palestinian front, that price has gone up considerably. The Saudis are using the word genocide in talking about what Israel is doing. They cannot be in a position where they're talking about Israel is committing a genocide and at the same time turn around and sign a normalization deal. However they may feel about the Palestinians, whether they care about Palestinians or not, as the regime, the fact is that the Saudi public cares, the Arab public cares, the broader Muslim world cares a great deal about the Palestinian issue and about Palestinian rights. And in fact, we've discovered that large pockets of the Western world also care about those same rights. So I don't think it's going to be as clear-cut as Trump would like it to be. But I think that's an indication of how much of a priority it's going to be for him. He wants it to be. It's clearly something he aspires to, but I think there's a bit of a reality check that will happen once the Saudis have made their views clear.
Thank you, Khaled. We've got a couple of questions from the audience around the issue of reconstruction. and I want to pose them to the entire group, whoever wants to weigh in. The first piece of this is sort of, do you believe that reconstruction is even going to be permitted to happen in the so-called phase three of the deal? After everything that the Israelis had done to sort of destroy as much as they possibly can in Gaza, would they seriously allow reconstruction to take place? And then secondly, can you talk about what some of the political obstacles are to getting to that stage where actual reconstruction is beginning to take place? And perhaps add as well some of the logistical challenges that are less understood. Anyone want to begin tackling these reconstruction questions?
I think Jihad is probably the best place to answer this question. But I know in my mind, the question is, even before you get to what the Israelis will or will not allow, is reconstruction even possible at this stage? When you look at the percentages of things that have been destroyed, infrastructure, 92% of homes damaged or destroyed. It would take 8 to 10 years just to clear the rubble. And so I don't have an answer, and I guess I would put the question to Jihad or Delia: is construction, reconstruction, even possible, or will Gaza simply be depopulated over time and people will gradually leave?
I think reconstruction is possible if there is a political will to do so. As I said earlier, it depends on the region. It depends on what the governments, the countries that worked hard to broker this deal, especially Egypt and Qatar, would be willing to do. In terms of Gaza's depopulation, I think this is a red line for Arab countries, especially Egypt. In the first 2 weeks of this war, even before there was any talk of large-scale displacement, and even before large-scale displacement happened, President Sisi and King Abdullah of Jordan and other officials in the Arab world started talking out of the blue about their rejection for any plans to displace Palestinians on a large scale and resettle them in other parts of the Arab world, which shows that displacement, they understood that Israel is going to use this genocide as an opportunity to depopulate Gaza and force large numbers of Palestinians to seek refuge especially in Egypt. And then throughout the war, we heard and saw reports and leaks, and we heard Israeli officials, pundits talk repeatedly about the need to expel Palestinians. Ben Gvir himself has repeatedly talked about the need to expel Palestinians. But what this war showed, what the past 15 months showed, that despite this brutal bombardment and killing and death and destruction and starvation, and the targeting of Gaza's health infrastructure and so on, Palestinians in Gaza refused to push towards the border with Egypt. And also it showed that Egypt is not interested in opening its territory for another Palestinian large wave of displacement. Now, if displacement and the depopulation of Gaza is not something that Palestinians in Gaza will do. And if it's rejected by the region, then there has to be a solution. And the solution that makes sense, the logical solution, is to rebuild Gaza. Palestinians in Gaza are resourceful, they're capable, and I think a reconstruction process, including the removal of the rubble and the rebuilding of various communities and institutions, can happen very quickly if there is a political will, and of course if you know there is international and regional support in terms of covering and contributing and investing in rebuilding Gaza. And I think this is not something that is impossible to happen, so long as there is a political will. And you know, ultimately, if Gaza remains a large refugee camp, this is not going to be in the interest of the region. And if there is a push for whatever schemes the new administration in the US has in mind for bringing peace and stability, this cannot and will not happen with Gaza being a pile of rubble. So I think it's doable. It can happen. Of course, there will be many logistical and practical obstacles and limitations and challenges. The 2014 reconstruction mechanism cannot be replicated. I mean, up until the beginning of this war, there have been buildings and structures and communities that we're still awaiting reconstruction, and the reconstruction mechanism that was created following the 2014 war did not allow for a complete rebuilding of Gaza because of all of the restrictions that were put. Every bag of cement had to be tracked. There were many layers of monitoring that ultimately proved unsuccessful in and only harmed the civilian population of Gaza. A large-scale reconstruction process of Gaza requires the involvement of Palestinians, their national institutions, the Palestinian civil society, bringing in Palestinian experts. This is going to be an endeavor that will include many political, social, and legal challenges, and that will need to be addressed in the coming months and years. For example, when it comes to rebuilding refugee camps, what would that mean for Palestinian refugees in Gaza? What does the rebuilding of a refugee camp means moving forward from a practical point of view, but also from a political and legal point of view? There will... Yes.
Can I just expand on this a little bit and ask you to react to it? You know, in 2008, 2009, the Israeli war at the time was unprecedented in terms of the scale of destruction that it wrought on the Gaza Strip. We had not seen anything like it before. There was a reconstruction effort again in 2014, unprecedented destruction and need for urgent reconstruction after that. And of course, what we've seen over the past 15 months is in a completely different category. And a scale of destruction that is almost complete across the Gaza Strip. After 2008, 2009, and 2014, there was really no change to the political situation. And Gaza went back to being a territory that was under siege. The fundamental conditions that led to those wars did not change. And here we are again facing a moment where we're looking at the need for really historic investment and a rebuilding project that is, you know, unparalleled. How is there going to be a will to participate in reconstruction on such a scale, short of any clear political horizon and shift and the political situation in Gaza, which doesn't seem to be in the offing right now, right? Yeah, that's the question that I wanted to put to you as you were talking about this.
No,
Can I
absolutely. And
also,
yeah, go ahead.
Jihad, can I just tack on
Yeah.
to that also? Sorry, just because I think it's important to unpack it. I mean, do you see any change in Hamas's governing power in Gaza changing? Like, is that set against reconstruction in terms of the U.S., Israel, and other actors? Like, do they expect Hamas to kind of, change its power in Gaza in order to get that reconstruction?
Both your question and Yusuf's are strongly connected. This Marshall Plan for Gaza, right? If if I may, in terms of scale, in terms of investment, in terms of this is going to be something that will cost billions and billions of dollars. I mean, initial assessments we're talking about 20 to 30 billion dollars worth of damage, if not more. And of course, this cannot happen without a context of political progress made in terms of recognizing Palestinian statehood, ending the constant efforts to undermine and fragment the Palestinian body politic and empower one Palestinian political force at the expense of another. And this cannot happen without removing the externally imposed obstacles that prevent Palestinians from achieving national unity. And to answer your question, Myrav, the Hamas understood that in order for rebuilding, reconstruction, and for Gaza to be reopened to the outside world, it perhaps shouldn't be part of the governance structure of post-war Gaza. What was the solution to this obstacle? Obviously, Hamas will not commit collective suicide. They're still going to be in Gaza. The solution was the creation of a community support committee that was a body of technocrats and academics and civil society leaders that was negotiated and agreed upon by Fatah and Hamas in Cairo in the weeks and months leading up to the ceasefire agreement, and it was happening as a parallel path, a path parallel to the ceasefire talks. The Egyptians helped broker the talks between Fatah and Hamas to come up with this so-called community support committee, which would be a committee of technocrats who will play a role in governing Gaza's affairs post-war. However, this effort was later on rejected by President Abbas, and one of the concerns that were cited for why he didn't proceed with the creation of this body was out of fears that it might bring about international sanctions, that it might be something that will bring consequences for the PA that it didn't want to deal with. And so this speaks again to how the role the international community and especially the United States play in creating obstacles that ultimately does not allow for any productive effort on the part of Palestinians to manage their affairs, let alone deal with the consequences of a genocide and the rebuilding of a place like Gaza.
Thank you very much for that, Jihad. Obviously, this is something that we're going to be watching very closely as the ceasefire deal is implemented, and surely a topic that we will be discussing again, but we'll have to conclude this conversation for today. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today on this webinar and engaging with our speakers. And thank you to this outstanding panel for being so generous with your time and with your insights. Please continue to follow the work of the Arab Center at arabcenterdc.org, and have a great day.